Hi, welcome. It is May 2nd, and today we're getting very close to the end of 2nd Samuel here, and moving on into Kings. Still working through Chronicles as well. But we're moving through some more accounts on David, and in our reading today, you'll notice again we get these parallel accounts between 2nd Samuel and 1st Chronicles, although there are some differences here. But there are a couple of troubling aspects to the account today. You know, as we read through this text, we get to the end, and you know, there's the aspect of David counting his army. Then there's at the end David paying for that threshing floor in order to build the altar and saying, I'm not going to give an offering that costs me nothing. And well, that's a great sentiment. And then we start to get this transition into his son Solomon, who would be the next king and who's going to start this building of God's temple. And that's kind of cool too, as we now move into that. But there's the troubling section in here that I kind of wanted to focus on a little bit. Number one, it's the beginning of our text today, which talks about in Samuel that God seems to be directing David to commit what ultimately becomes a sin, and that's to have his army counted. In First Chronicles, the chronicler decides to avoid kind of that difficulty and say it's Satan that's causing David to do this. And I think, so that's a troubling part. And number two is, so what's so bad about getting your army counted? Because then we find out that the prophet Gad tells David, well, you got an option behind door number 1, door number 2, or door number 3 in terms of your punishment. But I'd like to go ahead, and address these things real quick. Number one, where we have a big problem with saying that God caused David to become angry at this point. The writers in the Old Testament didn't have a problem with seeing God as the one who is in control of everything. And ultimately, we as believers have to also admit that God rules over Satan and allows Satan the latitude that he has. And so Satan's ability to tempt us and move us in a direction is still ultimately under God's control. And we don't often think of it that way, but the Old Testament writers were very willing to acknowledge that from the beginning. So while it seems that God's making David sin and then going to punish him for it, it's not quite that cut and dried. God oversees what's going on, but in reality, it's David's sin, and that causes him to do that. So if we can get beyond that and get to this point to where we can say, well, what's going on then here with this census? One commentator basically likened it to the fact that David, this man who always looked to the Lord as his strength, who's giving him victory after victory after victory, reaches just this one point where all of a sudden kind of lets his pride take over and says, you know what? I want to count my army. I want to see how many there are. And Joab, once again, who's thinking in political terms and also in terms of from just your basic standpoint of what's good and right, is saying, well, why do you need to do that? You don't need to do that. You have a huge army. Why do you have to count them? Number one, it's going to bring down morale. It's going to use up a lot of resources. But nonetheless, the king gets to have his say and his way. And so the count is done. David finds out that, if it is his pride, that now God is angry at him, and he faces these 3 punishments and accepts one, which is that plague, which ultimately God stays at the hand of that angel at that point, right there on the doorstep. But it brings me to that whole business of pride goeth before a fall, and of course that's Proverbs 16 verse 18. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. And I like to think of that here in this case. It seems to fit that David, at one point, who's always trusting in God, here at this moment of weakness, and certainly Satan jumps in, and certainly at one level God says, yes, go ahead. David takes a fall. Unfortunately, what we find out here too is that many suffer and die because of their leader's mistake. That still goes on today. Sometimes, I make my prideful mistakes, depend too much on my own ability or my skill, or think I'm pretty cool, or have done a great thing, and in the end, I kind of get brought low. That happens to all of us on one level. I think one of the important aspects of being a leader is that you have to learn to rise above that, because when you get prideful and you make a mistake, as in this case, many people suffer or even die, and it's unfortunate, but we have to continue to look to the bigger picture of God's plan and what He's trying to accomplish. So I guess in the end, what we need to remember here is that even King David struggled sometimes with his pride, and maybe it's a day for us to kind of focus on our own lives. Are there some things that maybe our pride is reaching a point where, we may need to temper it a little bit? And so I'm examining that in my own life, in my own ministry, and then coming before the Lord as David did, and say, I'll lay myself at your feet, and pray for your mercy and accept your mercy and grace. And in our case, we celebrate the fact that Jesus is the one who allows us to come directly to God, to admit our sin, and to receive forgiveness. And so even in the midst of this struggle today, for us, there's that good news that goes with it. So let's keep that pride in check as we go forward this day and every day, and take that lesson to heart. We'll talk to you again soon.